Good afternoon, everyone. Happy almost game day. Go Irish. My name is Paige Muir, and I'm a senior here at Notre Dame. And I am so excited and honored to introduce Professor Davin Raiha today. Professor Raiha is an associate teaching professor in the Department of Economics and is a fellow with the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate. Before joining Notre Dame, he received his doctorate from Stanford University and taught at the University of Western Ontario and Indiana University. His research interests include sports public policy, particularly the public finance of sports, sports analytics, and the application of game theory in sports contexts. Professor Raiha offered an upper year level economics course called Sports Economics last fall, and as an econ major and a sport media and culture minor, this was the perfect combination of my academic and personal interests, so I jumped at the opportunity to take it. The class was as good as I had hoped it would be. We explored league models, Nash bargaining, and collusion in sports. Dr. Raiha was super engaging and was clearly passionate about the material. The course centered around our capstone projects, where each student developed a unique research question, gathered and coded data, and wrote and presented a final research paper based on our findings. I was particularly interested in the determinants of Major League Soccer attendance and looked at different macroeconomic factors and individual competition between other major leagues that determine the success of the MLS. Everyone's topic was super unique, from F1 to MLB. Dr. Raiha helped us hone and refine our topics throughout the semester. Aside from his excellence in the classroom, Dr. Raiha showed keen interest in us outside of the classroom. He invited the entire class over for dinner during the semester and showed us how he trains for the sport of strongman. He had us participate in events such as lifting stones, weight over bar, and grip strength events. Spoiler alert, no one in the class could even handle the lightest weight Professor Raiha trains with. Strong body, stronger mind. Professor Raiha truly is one of the best professors I've had here at Notre Dame. He is among the most skilled in lectures at Notre Dame and was also personally engaging with students throughout the course. I was lucky enough to have Dr. Raiha for an entire semester, and I am so excited for everyone here to get a taste of Dr. Raiha's ideas, perspectives, and skill duration. So without further ado, may I present Professor Raiha.
Oops. Thank you so much, Paige, for very kind words, and you really hyped me up quite a bit there. I think if I could deliver on even half of that, I think I'll have a very successful talk today. So I think to get things started, actually, I wanted to just sort of see by show of hands, who in this room is a fan of the Chicago Blackhawks? A few? Anybody who definitely roots actively against the Chicago Blackhawks? Okay, a few others, so the room is a little bit divided. So depending on which side of that divide you're on, the big things that I'm going to be talking about today are either going to be things that are going to bring up painful memories, or you're going to view with a lot of glee too as well. And you're going to find out exactly sort of which side it's going to be. But what I want to tell you about is primarily about a very interesting case study. It's an example of how we understand and how we can see how the economy itself impacts the world of sports in profound ways. Like normally, even in sports economics, we're often concerned by thinking about how the world of sports, for instance, could have economic impacts, whether it's the impacts of particular sporting events, hosting football game days, or even building stadiums and other kind of capital projects. But what I want to show you primarily today is actually an interesting case of looking at things the other way around, looking at the sports impact of the economy. And indeed, as I was giving you a bit of a preview, a lot of this particular case has to do specifically with the Chicago Blackhawks. Now again, for those of you who are Blackhawks fans, and I saw a few hands up there, I'm sure you would agree that the last number of seasons have not exactly lived up to their hype. They haven't been necessarily the most enjoyable seasons. But what's interesting is to try and figure out what were the causes of this. I mean, certainly teams move through certain cycles, especially in leagues such as the National Hockey League, which is very competitive. We expect franchises to go through peaks and troughs. But at the same time, it's interesting to isolate some of the particular effects of what causes franchises to go through these things, in particular when they have perhaps less usual causes. And particularly, you can see up here from this article here, we're going to even say the fall of the Chicago Blackhawks dynasty is actually a lesson in macroeconomics. It's that lesson that I'd like to focus in on today. Now, the thing that we're trying to connect ultimately here, this is the big connection that we want to see. Because when you're a Chicago Blackhawks fan and you've been looking at how the team has been struggling the last 8 or 9 seasons, you might want to wonder who to blame as part of that process. I have a particular place where you can point that blame squarely because of the macroeconomics, and it isn't in a place where you would expect. But I would sort of lay the primary blame for what has happened with the Chicago Blackhawks right at the feet of the country of Saudi Arabia, and particular, the shift in their oil production policies that began all the way back in November of 2014, so 10 years ago. And now I know that seems already like a jump. How in the world do you get from the oil production policies of a country completely on the other side of the planet, probably with oil policymakers that have never even heard of the Chicago Blackhawks, let alone follow them? How in the world do we end up with this affecting a major NHL franchise? Well, that's what we're going to try and learn and put together today. Because we can see that these two things are certainly very much related, but through a clear chain of different macroeconomic forces. Now, throughout all of this stuff, I am going to be calling on you in order to help me out through building this particular chain so that we can really understand these things, because I know that a number of the different elements here are definitely things that you're aware of, that you follow, and that are also important for building the broader picture. So let's start this chain of events right here with something that I know a lot of us have some experiences with it, personal or otherwise. We all know about foreign exchange markets, exchanging one type of money for another, whether it's US dollars for euros, Canadian dollars for US dollars, and so forth. But the first question I want to ask you, and I want to get some ideas out there in the broader audience, what are sort of the big factors we always hear about that tend to move exchange rates? Like, what are the things that, for instance, cause the US dollar, for instance, to appreciate relative to other currencies, or maybe even take a bit of a dip relative to other currencies? Now this is where I'm going to use the board.
Interest rates.
Interest rates, absolutely. And how do interest rates channel into, for instance, the value of the US dollar?
Well, I mean, if we, let's, in simplistic terms, if the Fed decides to increase our discount rate, it makes it a little more attractive for foreigners to invest in U.S. Treasuries.
Absolutely. That's a very clear channel for how we see this. So again, for those of you in the back that may have not had an opportunity to hear that, if interest rates go up in the United States, for instance, through Federal Reserve actions or otherwise, certainly U.S. Treasuries, as well as maybe a number of other U.S. Debt instruments, certainly go up in value. They become more attractive investors to folks that are abroad. That inflow of investment certainly creates an appreciation for the US dollar. What are other factors that potentially affect exchange rates? Sorry, which? GDP, absolutely. And what would be sort of a reason why GDP would impact the dollar? You're sort of saying broadly the economic performance of the country.
Right. So, I mean, if a country is doing very well, you would think that that's going to have a higher value than a country that's not doing very well in GDP.
Absolutely. So if the economy is performing well, then people may think of that as a great place potentially to invest. Investors potentially reallocate their decisions about where to make those investments. And if they want to invest in the United States, they're going to need US dollars in order to do it. And that certainly puts upward pressure on the US dollar. What are other factors that potentially affect exchange rates? Yes?
Political changes?
Yeah, absolutely. What would be some reasons for why that would have impacts?
For example, the election just happened a couple of weeks ago. People might get scared about changes they're going to be making. Absolutely. Invest as much or do anything as much.
Yeah, absolutely. This is certainly one that's a very commonly cited impact on exchange rates. And you're right that it works through a variety of different mechanisms. You're mentioning things about elections. You know, depending on how close an election is, that potentially creates uncertainty about things. People are not necessarily sure of what the next direction of policy may be. And different policies might have different implications, even for certain parts of the economy. And so certainly people might decide to either hold off on investing in things or doing other things until some of that uncertainty gets resolved. But definitely in the earliest stages, certainly of new political regimes and governments, there's still always a lot of uncertainty on that. That definitely affects foreign exchange markets. Any other factors that we can think of that are also relevant?
Discrepancies in inflation rates domestically.
Oh, absolutely. Inflation rates, definitely. And what would be sort of some of the direct channels through how inflation impacts exchange rates?
If inflation is different in one country as compared to the other, the exchange rate between these countries will change accordingly.
Yeah, and which one is going to, for instance, appreciate or depreciate? Like suppose you have one country A is experiencing a lot of inflation, country B is not. What would you expect to happen with their relative exchange rates?
So if inflation is higher in one country and lower in the other, then the exchange rate is going to favor the one that's lower.
Yeah, absolutely. The one that tends to have more stable prices will tend to be viewed as being a more valuable currency because what inflation is effectively doing is it's devaluing that money itself. That money doesn't purchase as much stuff. It has less real purchasing power. Anytime economists use the word real, we're not thinking about virtual or imaginary as another alternative to that. We're usually just referring to actual things, goods and services and other things that one might produce or buy. But you're absolutely right that that plays a very important factor with exchange rates, and we've seen that certainly at various points in time. Any other factors that we can think of? Perhaps maybe even the world of exports and imports and international trade.
Yes. I was just going to say geopolitical stability or instability.
Absolutely. So we can think of political changes. We can think of broader geopolitical stability. Absolutely, I think through a lot of the similar channels that we were just talking about. But what about, for instance, things like exports? Like, for instance, yeah, things like trade deficits or trade surpluses. Like, for instance, if there's a country that exports a lot of some particular commodity or some particular product, and that product becomes especially important or popular in the world, what do you think is going to happen to the exchange rate for that country's currency? If everyone wants their stuff, I think we can all agree their currency is probably going to get stronger. I mean, ultimately, all of the factors that we've been talking about ultimately come back to the two broad factors that affect any price that is determined by a market. And those two big factors, especially those of you that have taken principles of economics before, supply and demand. Anytime we're really trying to determine the price of something out there, and exchange rates are, in fact, just another price. They're the price of one type of money relative to another. If we want to understand them, we just simply have to understand the broad supply and demand factors that are affecting that. So when we said things like interest rate changes, we were basically saying that, yes, the demand for the US dollar is going to change because the relative investments in debt instruments and bonds is going to be better in that country. When we said things like the economic performance or GDP, if the country is performing well and there are lots of economic opportunities, or even just the fact that people need a lot more money in order to be able to buy the things that they're interested in buying, that also causes a currency to appreciate and relates to the demand for that currency. when we were talking about things like political changes, geopolitical stability, all those things that potentially cause uncertainty or shifts in policies. Those also have effects on demand, either by creating an environment where people want to invest in that, or maybe where they're also potentially cautious about it. And then especially things like inflation as well. Again, whether you want to hold the money or have a money that's potentially depreciating in value in itself in real terms. But when we're thinking about, for instance, the exports part of this too as well, that's also working through this demand factor that we've been identifying here. So in particular, if people want to buy something that is made or built or originates from some particular country, they're going to need that country's currency in order to get it. Now let's think about the opposite situation. If, for instance, people didn't want as much of this export coming from a particular country, or, for instance, what if the value of those exports suddenly fell in value? What would happen to that country's currency that tends to be an exporter of that thing? It would go down, absolutely. The exact opposite force of what we looked here. So we can start to see how these things matter and the broad factors that affect exchange rates. Now you can see from my slide up there, I'm highlighting a particular exchange rate that's going to be especially helpful for us to understand for this particular lesson, and that is the specific exchange rate between the US dollar and the Canadian dollar. Let's have a look here. We were just talking about the importance of exports, and if we look at Canada's economy, there are a variety of exports that are important, but certainly one of the most important exports for Canada's economy in recent decades has been oil. Especially if we look back even about 10 years ago. Oil was hands down Canada's #1 export, and if we're thinking about its broader importance for economic performance and GDP, it was actually the largest contributor to capital investments in the country. Like the most value in terms of actual machinery, equipment, and other things was going into Canada's oil patch. So certainly a very, very important driver of things. But at the same time, we can see how correlated as a result the Canadian dollar is with the price of oil. So if we're wondering what we're looking at in this picture here, in red is the value of the Canadian dollar relative to the US dollar, and in gray we have sort of the crude oil price per barrel. And we can see how those things change, but also move quite closely together. Now here's the thing. We're going to be relating this to hockey and stuff like that. Why do you think that the National Hockey League would actually be interested or care about this particular exchange rate?
You got to pay in US dollars even though in Canada?
Right, so we know that the league operates across both Canada and the United States, and you certainly nailed one important factor in that the National Hockey League pays its players and its salaries and everything like that in US dollars. And that includes Canadian franchises or Canadian-based franchises. So unlike, perhaps even some of the other major sports leagues, even though, Major League Baseball, the NBA operate across both the United States and Canada, the National Hockey League certainly has far more considerable overlap in this. And we're going to see how that matters. Now, what we've got to do is we've got to go back in time a little bit in order to really begin this story to see some major events that basically led into the events concerning the Chicago Blackhawks. And all of this really begins about 11 years ago. This was in November 26, 2013. Now again, I'm not sure. Is there anyone in this room here visiting from Canada by any chance? Okay, good number. So all of you, you've heard about Rogers, one of the big TV telecommunications companies in Canada. They struck a historic television deal with the National Hockey League back in November of 2013. It was the largest TV deal in National Hockey League history by a country mile, and it represented, those TV rights, $5.2 billion over 12 years. It's hard to describe what an enormous sum this is for the National Hockey League, especially at this time, in that it represented approximately an 8 to 12% increase in total league revenue just from this one TV contract. An enormously big deal for the league. Now, there is another important variable that affects the competitive landscape in the National Hockey League that is directly linked to the revenue that the league brings in. Does anyone know what that key mechanism is, or that competitive balance aspect of the league is? Yes?
Salary cap?
It's the salary cap. So we've seen, certainly if you're familiar with sports, especially in North America, you're familiar with different types of regimes that affect potentially the competitive landscape. The National Hockey League's version of this, the salary cap, is indeed a hard salary cap wherein teams are not permitted to spend more than a particular amount. There's no opportunity for paying a luxury tax or some other kind of overspending on this. And indeed, that salary cap is very much determined by a direct formula with how much revenue the league brings in. So certainly a very important variable on this. And right after this deal was finalized, folks across Canada, especially in the media, were trying to figure out how this was going to impact the National Hockey League's salary cap. And instantly, they were doing a number of different projections. In particular, even by the end of the 21-22 season, they were projecting an NHL salary cap of over $100 million. Interesting projections. Now, one of the important things to bear in mind is sort of how this played out and some of the timing of this. So obviously, this TV deal is agreed upon in the midst of an NHL season. This is during the 2013-2014 NHL season. The league obviously has an existing TV contract at that time that not only runs the length of that season, but also the entire NHL season to follow. That is the 2014 and 2015 season. This means that revenues coming in from this particular TV deal do not begin until basically the fall of 2015 for the beginning of the 2015-2016 season. And that timing is pretty important in this case. Again, when they're looking at the effects of this, and they do some calculations of what they estimate to be the effect on the salary cap, again, that particular season is the last one under the old TV deal, and then they do some different scenarios on what would happen with and without that particular deal. And again, when they're looking at these projections of the salary cap, we're sort of like estimating that with that TV deal, the salary cap changing between the 14-15 season to the 15-16 season would be an increase of somewhere around $7 to $8 million per year. And that's an enormous increase in the salary cap because that, well, had it happened, would have been the largest single season increase in the salary cap in NHL salary cap history. So it was certainly something that a lot of GMs were potentially excited about. And I would say one particular GM got very excited about this. He was also in an interesting situation too. So you had two key players, Jonathan Toews, Patrick Kane. Those of you that are Chicago Blackhawks fans definitely know those names. Absolute Blackhawks legends. At this point in time, when they reached July 1st in 2014, they were in the interesting situation that they were entering the final year of their existing NHL contracts with the Blackhawks, and they were due to become unrestricted free agents in the following summer, in the summer of 2015. Of course, GM Stan Bowman did not want Kane and Toews to go anywhere near free agency. To this point in time, Kane and Toews were not only established as consensus top 5 players in the league, they had already led the Chicago Blackhawks from ending one of the longest Stanley Cup droughts in league history to winning 2 Stanley Cups in that particular era, when they won the Cup in 2010 as well as in 2013. So he definitely wanted to wrap up these players. Now, at the same time, this TV deal had just been announced in the previous November. There were a lot of rosy predictions as to where the salary cap was going to go. So it didn't seem to be, at least at this time, a serious problem to sign them to particularly lucrative deals. And so he inked them each to identical contracts worth in total $84 million over 8 seasons, so $10.5 million a year. And these were the largest contracts in the NHL at this time. In fact, they were a full $1 million per year greater than any of the next closest contracts in the league at the time. Now, that said, throughout this whole case, I would say we probably shouldn't be too hard on GM Stan Bowman. He was in a situation where he had his superstar players. These players were, I think by any and all accounts, very underpaid in the years leading up to this contract. Because at this time, even though they were consensus top 5 players, they were, I believe, the 38th and 39th highest paid players in the league. So they weren't getting paid anywhere close to what they had brought to the franchise. So they certainly deserved a significant pay bump. And Bowman didn't have a whole lot of bargaining power in that relationship as it was. Now here's where we've got to introduce something with Saudi Arabia. November 27th, 2014 is the day that should probably live in infamy in all of the hearts of Chicago Blackhawks fans, though nobody would have seen this coming necessarily at the time. But this is the particular day when OPEC did a complete 180 on decades worth of oil policies. Again, those of you that are familiar with OPEC, what did OPEC traditionally do with the supply of oil? With how much production they did? They controlled it, but in what way? To expand it, contract it? Whatever suited them. Well, what generally suited them for most of their history? Yeah, they would try to prop up the price of oil by reducing or managing how much they actually produced. That was always the key thing. That was the big idea on which OPEC was effectively founded, and that was the broad philosophy. Now, by the time we get to 2014, a lot of things have developed and evolved in the world of oil production. In particular, something that OPEC members were not particularly thrilled about was that other countries, other non-OPEC members, were increasingly eating into their market shares. You had oil producers in Canada, and Canada's not part of OPEC, increasingly extracting the oil sands oil in Canada. You had other shale producers in the United States. You had other producers that were not members of OPEC gradually working their way into the market and increasing their share of the market. OPEC looked at the situation largely on the basis of what Saudi Arabia was pushing, and they said, look, the difference between us and these other producers is that we are the lowest cost producers of oil. It's much easier for us to be able to produce this stuff. So rather than lose more market share, let's just try and drive them out of business. So they went the other way. Rather than restrict oil production, they increased it and increased it enormously. And with that, the price of oil came crashing down from over $100 US per barrel to around 40 in just a matter of a few months. And with this, that was where we can see this big crash. For instance, in the price of oil, but also dragging along with it the value of the Canadian dollar. The Canadian dollar at that time, actually even before this, was hovering somewhere in the ballpark of, as we can see, even in this period of time here, at a greater value than the US dollar. And that was a pretty unusual thing when we look at broader Canadian dollar history. And that indeed changed very rapidly in this time period. We also have to bear in mind that beyond the fact that this was an important export, I also mentioned the fact that GDP and economic performance affects exchange rates. Canada's economy promptly went into a recession in the first quarter of 2015, again, as oil producers and oil extraction in Canada came to basically a virtual halt. Now the question is, why does this matter? And why does this matter now for the National Hockey League? Can we think about what this next step would be? Why would the National Hockey League care about this particular thing that's happening? Yes?
A lot of revenue from Canada is driven in Canadian dollars from 7 teams.
Absolutely. A lot of revenue is actually generated in Canadian dollars. In particular, That broadcast deal for the national broadcast rates in Canada, that was denominated in Canadian dollars. OPEC was making these changes before even a single dollar was transferring from Rogers to the National Hockey League, and before that could even begin, the value of this contract lost over a quarter of its value. So, National Hockey League revenue did not increase in the way that they would have necessarily predicted, and it followed exactly what happened with the Canadian dollar. Again, as we said, a very significant portion of league revenues. Aside from this TV deal, already 35% of league revenue was generated in Canadian dollars. So there was a lot of value to potentially lose on a huge depreciation of the Canadian dollar. And again, we can see this full timeline of events here and how they impact things. Again, Kane and Taves, when they signed in July 2014, oil is at one of its highest prices ever historically. Of course, that changes rapidly afterwards.
What happened to the US dollar during the same time? Did it go down?
We're looking at the Canadian dollar US dollar exchange rate here, so it's the exact mirror image of that. This is the value of the Canadian dollar relative to the US dollar. Sorry, that was on our previous one that we had. Okay. To bring up some nice last good memories, especially for Chicago Blackhawks fans in the room, the 2014-2015 team, that may have been the best Chicago Blackhawks team of all time, arguably. They absolutely dominated the league that year. They were absolutely excellent in the playoffs, and they had a roster that was just unbelievably, not only unbelievably talented, but unbelievably deep. I remember even at that trade deadline in 2015 too as well, they went out and acquired all of the major pieces that were on the market at that time and really assembled one of the most impressive teams of the modern cap era in the NHL. And we can see, indeed, this roster was led primarily by Kane and Taves. This is the playoff stats for the entire Chicago Blackhawks team at this time. Now, one thing I want to ask you, though, is when we're looking at this roster here, do we see any signs that there could be some clouds on the horizon or any potential challenges to overcome?
Yes. Teams don't have contracts for the next season.
Ooh, we can see how many players bolded in here that don't have contracts even for the next season itself. And not only even beyond that, we see a lot of players too as well where they're only signed for just another year too as well. So sure, the Blackhawks had their core wrapped up for a good period of time, but certainly they didn't have the vast majority of the roster signed long term. Now again, for those of you that may not be as familiar with the sport of hockey relative to sports like basketball or something like that, but it takes more than 5 players in order to field a competitive hockey team. You need a lot of depth, and that was certainly a strength of this team, because even when we look at this particular team, a lot of things had to be balanced. I mean, even Kane and Taves, they were the leading scorers during the whole playoffs, but in that Stanley Cup final series against the Tampa Bay Lightning, they only scored a combined 2 goals. So this team relied very much on a wide supporting cast in order to deliver this title. Now the question, of course, becomes, the NHL salary cap does not go up by the amount predicted, even though Kane and Taves' salary cap hit goes up by $8 million combined. In the end, if you're wondering, the salary cap for the Blackhawks ended up going up by, I think, $1.3 million rather than the $8 million that they need in order to have Kane and Taves. So the question is, what did they have to give up in order to keep Kane and Taves? Well, in the immediate summer, right after the Stanley Cup, these 7 players. 7 full-time major NHL roster players. And for those of you that follow the league or follow the Blackhawks, you'll know that a lot of these names here are not inconsequential. You have players like Brandon Saad, Patrick Sharp, Kimmo Timonen, and Chris Versteeg. These were very important members of the team. And indeed, when we look at this collection of players, they were actually responsible for, I think, about 40% of the team's goals in that Stanley Cup final series. I believe also close to 40% of the team's game-winning goals throughout that entire playoffs. In short, The Chicago Blackhawks do not win that Stanley Cup without these 7 players. And they were gone. And the bleeding didn't end there. Even in the summer after the 2015-2016 season, they had to continue to also shed salary. And 3 more players from that cup-winning roster were again traded or not re-signed and so forth. Now the question is what's the impact of all of this? Because certainly when Kane and Toews were signed in 2014, there was a lot of optimism for the future. A lot of people said, okay, great, they locked up their core for a long period of time. This is going to be a team that is going to be a perennial cup contender year after year. And a lot of that made sense because if we look at the era leading up to these contracts for Kane and Toews, let's look at the Chicago Blackhawks' success. I mean, I've got the pictures of the Stanley Cup banners here, but let's break it down. 3 Stanley Cups, 3 finals appearances, 4 conference finals appearances. They won a staggering 18 playoff rounds in those eight years leading up to 2015. And they also qualified for the playoffs in 7 out of those 8 years. And if you're wondering what was the year that they missed the playoffs, it was the very first year of that 8-year window when Kane and Toews were basically rookies. So, very much so, Kane and Toews came in, the franchise absolutely transformed, and they turned into the absolute powerhouse of the league. Again, it's not overstating it that at this period of time, the Stanley Cup necessarily ran through Chicago because not only did the Chicago Blackhawks win 3 Stanley Cups in a 6-year window, even in the 4 seasons leading up to that 2015 Cup, either Chicago won the Cup or the eventual Cup champion had to beat Chicago in order to win the Cup. So absolutely, they were essential to the broad competitive landscape of the league. Now let's see what has happened since the Kane and Toews deal was signed in 2014, or began in the 2015-2016 season. Stanley Cups, 0. Finals reached, 0. Conference finals reached, 0. Playoff rounds won, 0. Qualified for playoffs, 3. And that 3 probably deserves a bit of an asterisk because that also included the COVID bubble sort of season where they artificially expanded the number of teams that they were allowing into the playoffs. And Chicago got in by virtue of beating the Edmonton Oilers in a play-in series and stuff. Otherwise, those 2 seasons where they did qualify for the playoffs were the seasons immediately after that Cup final. So it's been a fairly lean time, absolutely, for the Chicago Blackhawks and recent seasons. And absolutely, if you told anybody that, for instance, when Kane and Toews signed these contracts, that in the 8 years of their contracts, that the Chicago Blackhawks would have won 0 playoff rounds, that would have been very difficult to fathom. But that's indeed what has happened. The pain continues, of course. This is the standings in the Western Conference at the end of last season. As we know, the Chicago Blackhawks were not contending for a playoff spot at basically any point in the season. And only an almost historically bad season by the San Jose Sharks outdid the Chicago Blackhawks last year, at least in the Western Conference.
Yeah, they've got some great draft picks, though.
They have, certainly. Yeah, drafting first overall helps a bit. You know, they started with that piece, I guess, back in the mid-2000s when they drafted to both Toews and Kane. Now, what happened to these players, you might be wondering too as well. I mean, those of you who are Blackhawks fans know, but Jonathan Toews is basically all but retired. The contract expired. He has not signed with any NHL team. But at the same time, even though he hasn't played in a couple of seasons, he has not officially announced any retirement. He's had some longer-term health issues, especially associated with COVID and other things. Patrick Kane went on to greener pastures. He basically, in his very last season, for the last stretch of that contract, he was traded at the NHL trade deadline, and he did not give the Chicago Blackhawks a whole lot of latitude in determining where he could get traded to. He basically named his team, the New York Rangers, and so the Chicago Blackhawks basically only got a bag of pucks back in return for him. In any case, even after that, he signed with the Detroit Red Wings, where he's currently playing. In any case, this is an interesting moment to actually highlight something about the salary cap in the National Hockey League, and also even just sort of thinking about how salary structure has historically impacted the competitiveness of teams. I mean, obviously, the Chicago Blackhawks were an interesting situation where they're paying 2 players greater than $10 million per year, and they were the first NHL team to do so. Other teams have followed suit too as well. However, the actual playoff success of such teams certainly has taken a long time. So for instance, do you know when it was when the very first NHL team that had even a single player paid more than $10 million even won a single playoff round? So we saw the Blackhawks didn't do it. Yes?
I know because I'm a Rangers fan in 2022.
A little bit earlier than that. It took all the way to 2021. A full 5 years after these contracts came into effect before we even had a single player or a team with a single player earning over $10 million actually win a playoff round. That was the Montreal Canadiens beating the Toronto Maple Leafs, and Carey Price, the goaltender, being the one who was earning this. Now, the next question, of course, is when was the first team to win a Stanley Cup with a player that was earning over $10 million? That took another 2 years when the Vegas Golden Knights won the Stanley Cup with Jack Eichel lifting the cup as the sole $10 million player on that team. So certainly, myself, I can tell you, I'm a fan of the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the Toronto Maple Leafs have basically like, 4 or 5, at least 4 players being paid that amount. That has also not translated into any meaningful success for the team, at least recently. In any case, this also raises another important question. Could the NHL have seen this coming? Is there anything that could have been anticipated? I mean, I know Gary Bettman in the league doesn't have a seat in the OPEC offices and everything like that to see what they're talking about in 2015. But here's another interesting graph to look at. This is showing the history of the Canadian dollar-US dollar exchange rate going back to the mid-1990s. What do we notice about this period of time in which Kane and Taves are basically getting signed? It's an unusually high period of time where the Canadian dollar is particularly valuable. The other thing that we can notice about this is the enormous degree of volatility in it relative to the US dollar. And that's something that the league has definitely had to deal with even in the past. For instance, in the mid-1990s, not a whole lot of people recognize these particular jerseys here, but these are from 2 franchises that had to relocate from Canada to the United States. The first edition of the Winnipeg Jets, they had to leave and they became eventually the Arizona Coyotes, who are now the Utah hockey team with no name. Yet to be named Utah hockey team. And then the other one is the Quebec Nordiques that were based in Quebec City. They moved to become the Colorado Avalanche, and much to the chagrin and anger of Quebec City fans, they won the Stanley Cup immediately in the season after they relocated. Ooh, talk about rubbing salt in that wound. In any case, I think we were mentioning earlier that all the contracts in the National Hockey League are denominated and paid in US dollars. The TV contract was not, at least not the Canadian TV deal. But the interesting thing to note with that is that this was also not something that was always the case. Before the 1994 collective bargaining agreement in the National Hockey League, NHL players were being paid in local currency, which meant that if you played for a US team, you got paid US dollars. If you played for a Canadian team, you got paid Canadian dollars. So just think Wayne Gretzky, all of those glory years in Edmonton in the 1980s, he was getting paid Canadian dollars, not US dollars. Now, one thing to bear in mind for this is why they made that change. Well, they made that change precisely because of all of this. Because exchange rates between Canada and the US were becoming very volatile, and they were effectively passing that exchange rate risk on players, and it was affecting the markets. Like when you were a free agent in the market, you had to think to yourself, well, if I sign with Montreal or Toronto or something like that, and the Canadian dollar goes down, well, my actual income is going down effectively in that time period too. And so because this was becoming such an issue, the National Hockey League and the NHL Players Association negotiated this thing where all contracts would be denominated and paid in US dollars, so that way the players would not have to bear the brunt of this exchange rate risk. So exchange rate risk is a problem that the National Hockey League had to deal with in the past. And if you're thinking, well, maybe, that was a long time ago in the mid-1990s, maybe they forgot about that. Well, I can point out that the commissioner of the league was the same back then. It was also Gary Bettman at that time, too. In any case, when we were talking about TV contracts, I think you're making an excellent suggestion here, which is maybe they could have asked Rogers to pay the deal in Canadian dollars or other things, in US dollars. And that's an interesting idea, too, as well, because not only do I think you could have seen this coming, I think there are probably even steps that the league could have taken in order to mitigate this potential risk that's out there, especially given that you know that exchange rate risk is not only going to be affecting teams' revenues, it is affecting one of the most important variables that impacts the competitive landscape of the league, the salary cap. And so you'd think that the league would care a lot about preserving the integrity and the stability of that particular variable. In any case, they appear to have overlooked that, but at the same time, we can learn certainly from that lesson. Okay, so that completes this broad picture, connecting these two very different things. I know when you're sort of saying, and I announced it at the beginning, it seems like these things are worlds apart, and they sort of start that way. But through this case, we can see how macroeconomic forces have impacts, not only in the world of sports, but it really illustrates for us that learning about economics is incredibly valuable, almost no matter what kind of career path you want to take. I am absolutely positive that it does not say in any GM job description out there that you must have knowledge of macroeconomic forces in order to do whatever. But at the same time, we can see how it matters. It matters on who wins championships, and we can see how that has this effect. And so studying economics, studying its impact on things, understanding how it interrelates between the world of sports can be very important for also being able to appreciate what's going on even in the world of sports. Anyways, that's just finishing that news article here. Sort of before I wrap up, I'd actually like to tell you a little bit more about the field of sports economics and this particular course that I teach. The field of sports economics has actually been around for a little while, since the 1950s. This is acknowledged as the very first academic research paper to study the world of sports from an economist's perspective. And it was developed or written by a University of Chicago economist by the name of Simon Rottenberg. Interestingly enough, he did not go on to a career of writing other papers in sports economics. He wrote this first one, never wrote another one again, but this paper ended up spinning out an entire large and growing literature. And naturally, he started by answering some big questions in the world of baseball players' labor market. In any case, if we're thinking about the history of economics itself, economics really arrives in its modern form in the late 19th century, and it's largely developed at the University of Cambridge in England with Alfred Marshall, as well as his sort of group of other scholars that were around there. But by the mid-20th century, especially starting at the University of Chicago, economists start to do some interesting things. And one important figure within that movement is this economist and Nobel laureate by the name of Gary Becker. He's one of the first economists to study things that most of us would not refer to as being as part of the economy. Because normally you think about economics, like what do economists study? You think, well, they study the economy. Well, that's not entirely true. Gary Becker brought economics in a new direction, in an applied direction to basically apply economic theories, tools, and ideas to understand broader social phenomena. And one of the prime examples of this, for instance, was Gary Becker's analysis of the economics of crime. Like I can tell you, at the middle part of the 20th century, the prevailing viewpoint, scholarly-wise, in terms of crime was that crime was a very irrational thing, that criminals are kind of crazy. When they do things, they're doing things that are very unpredictable and stuff. Gary Becker actually showed that that's not the case, that criminals actually operate and behave with very predictable and rational patterns. They respond to incentives, they think about payoffs, and they indeed optimize based on their broader decisions, and showed that economic analysis and economic theory had valuable insights to contribute to understanding the world of crime. And those have been very influential ideas. They've helped design and potentially even reform and inform other ideas as it comes to different policies, especially in the world of crime and crime prevention. As I said, eventually economists start to apply economic tools in a variety of different areas, and principally, as we see with Simon Rottenberg, in the world of sports. Now, the field of sports economics has grown quite a bit in recent decades. There actually was launched a full-fledged academic journal specifically for sports economics back in the year 2000. There's whole professional associations of professors and scholars in this area. And there's a large enough body of research out there that even warrants the actual creation of volumes summarizing that literature. So there's a lot of exciting questions and research that has been done in recent decades. Now, in terms of the course and what sports economics that I teach, and Paige will remember a lot of these things, I generally divide the course into 4 broad units, covering broad areas of economics as they apply to the world of sports. The first one deals with the industrial organization of sports. That's looking at things like competitive balance, like league structure, or even the design of actual sports contests and sports events. In this sort of field, economists are trying to ask questions like, how should leagues be designed? What are the best ways to promote competitive balance? Is competitive balance an important and meaningful objective, even relative to other objectives that you may have? Even broader questions like, how can you design a contest or even allocate prizes? Like, for instance, if you were responsible for organizing a golf tournament and you have a certain amount of prize money, the question is, how would you want to allocate that prize money in a way that makes the athletes put on the best performance possible? Like, should you just put all the prize money on the winner and then nothing to anybody else? Or should you divide it up evenly among, say, like the top 10 or some other kind of schedule? That's an interesting economic design question that certainly plays and impacts the incentives that athletes have to exert effort and compete their best in these tournaments. And it's an interesting question to think about what would be the best way to do that or design that, and upon what factors would influence that kind of design. The other fields that we look at the labor economics in sports too as well. We look at athlete labor markets, especially the fact that labor markets for athletes tend to be very imperfectly competitive. I know it sounds like a bit of almost a shocking contrast, again, to what we mostly think about with athlete labor markets, but I can tell you this. In most economists' estimation, economists look at athletes as being one of the most underpaid professions that there is. And I'm including NFL, MLB, all of those pro athletes too as well. Because when economists look at the situation and we evaluate labor markets, our benchmark for thinking about what labor can effectively earn is the benchmark of a free market. And as we know, sports, and in particular labor markets in sports, are anything but free markets. In any case, those are some big things that we study within sports economics and labor. We also study the public economics of sports. There we try to delve into how sports potentially impact the economy and also the design of public policies as it relates to that. That's certainly some areas that are very close to my own academic research, especially on the public financing of sports. And then finally, probably closest to my heart, the applications of the field of game theory in sports. If you're wondering what game theory is, you may have heard this term before. Game theory is a branch of economics and mathematics that effectively studies the mathematics of strategy. How do players compete against one another? And it's largely concerned with developing mathematical models of this behavior in order to better understand strategic behavior between people. And that principally also is very applicable in the world of sports, because we see in sports so many different scenarios where we have lots of interesting strategic behavior. In any case, what we try to do in that section of the class is see to what extent economic theory and game theory can help us even with competing in sports. Can we help us not only understand how to think like a coach or a chess master or Wayne Gretzky or other, very, very smart players and stuff, can we think about how that can inform how we approach even the world of sports? Anyways, I hope those are interesting topics. If you're interested in learning more about sports economics, I'm happy to also stay here after the talk and answer questions that you may have. But I think also we've got a bit of time. I think we've got a little bit of time to answer some broader questions. Yes? Oops.
Since we're all here for an NCAA football game.
Yes.
And all of the changes that is occurring with amateur sports, are you going to be expanding your course to cover the NCAA level sports and the financial implications of what's going on?
Absolutely. That was one of the things we did talk about actually in sports economics and back when Paige was taking the course. One of the interesting things, if you're interested in actually even getting economist perspective on this, the reading that I had the class do for this was actually from the Alston versus NCAA Supreme Court case. That particular case is especially interesting, in part because it also led to the follow-on rulings that have come since there, and that led to NIL and also the more recent settlements and everything. But the interesting thing about that case was that the Alston side ended up hiring or getting the consulting work of a whole collection of sports economists. In fact, it was a list of, I think, 15 or 16 of probably the most important and influential sports economists in the world, all commenting on this particular case and effectively laying out the economic arguments based on this literature in sports economics. Now, as I mentioned, they were on the Alston side arguing against the NCAA and effectively making the argument that most economists would look at, that the NCAA was operating very much as a cartel in athlete labor markets, that they're colluding actively in ways that harm the welfare of the athletes itself. And not only do they make the argument that athlete welfare is harmed, they also make the other argument that fan welfare is harmed. And that's the bigger thing. That's the thing that a lot of folks don't always pay attention to. We think of frequently that competitive balance measures and other things in sports are just in some sense like a zero-sum game. It's just sort of allocating athletes to teams in a particular way. But that's not how most economists look at this. When we're looking at how much player talent there is and what ability is there, how the market is actually designed, in particular the labor market, affect fundamentally the decisions that athletes have to make, in particular their investment decisions in things like human capital and so forth. And so one of the arguments that's certainly made by the economists there is that because labor markets traditionally have been very restricted in college sports, athletes have not invested as much as they would otherwise invest, and that holds the quality of the sport itself back. And so one of the big things that we can potentially look forward to as labor markets for college athletes are changing with this is most economists make the prediction that the quality of college football is actually going to increase as we go in the future. We'll have more to look forward to as fans and everything. And that's another important dimension that certainly economists try to highlight as part of this. It's not just about athlete welfare being harmed, it's also about the fans. Yes?
From an economic perspective, though, is the current model sustainable? Because it feels a little bit like the Wild West. There's no salary cap. There's essentially just an open market. It resets every year. Like, to me, that almost is getting into the realm of irrational. And I'm wondering, does there need to be an external force to reset the market, or can the market regulate itself?
Well, let me respond with this question. Is there any other labor market in any other profession outside of sports that looks like the labor markets we see in sports? Like, is there another profession where when people enter the profession, they enter through a draft? Where their rights are acquired by an exclusive employer, they can only negotiate a contract with that one employer? When they're signed to that contract, they can't give 2 weeks' notice. They're signed to that and committed to it for a certain period of time. I mean, we see some contracts like this, where their actual employment rights can be traded geographically, and they don't have a choice in the matter in terms of where they actually get to live and work. When we think about it from this perspective, we can see that athlete labor markets are quite exceptional in terms of how restrictive they are and how they affect athletes itself. So one view is to sort of say, well, it looks like the Wild West compared to what we're used to in the world of sports. But what has been developing here is not at all unusual relative to most other labor markets that we consider just to be normal affairs in almost any other profession and industry. And I can tell sort of like from the broader perspective of most economists, markets are pretty good things. They don't work perfectly all the time, absolutely. There are well-known market failures, but I think what is an important thing to recognize is that economists generally only advocate for broad intervention and design of markets when there is a clear market failure. And what I would say is not so clear in the world of sports is what is the market failure there that requires all of this other restrictions that have very meaningful consequences for athletes and for fans too as well. Because we do a lot that hurt careers and everything. And even we're mentioning the Chicago Blackhawks and high draft picks and folks like Connor Bedard. And again, for me as an economist, it's really, really, in some ways amusing, but also puzzling when I watch the NHL draft or the draft in any other league. When we see athletes get selected first overall or any of the things, and they give a whole speech about how honored they feel. We wouldn't give that kind of speech if it was any other profession. If another profession was one where your exclusive rights to work were now monopolized by a single company, you would talk about how screwed you felt by it. And that's in some sense what I sort of say, like, athletes must have that perspective on this. You're not being honored by being selected on this. This is a severe restriction on your right to decide on where you work and for whom you work. And so when we think about the practical consequences, think of Connor Bedard for the Chicago Blackhawks, he is probably losing out in excess of $10 million a year from the particular contract restrictions that he faces in this. Is that a great consequence that we necessarily want to sort of see as part of this? Again, we got to balance a lot of different objectives from this, but I would say that that kind of perspective, the economist's perspective on these things, is not something that we frequently see get voiced to these kinds of debates or these kind of conversations about how to organize these things. But that is what I would sort of say is in some sense special and valuable about the field of sports economics when you have economists come to study these questions, because economists will just sort of cut to the core of things, evaluate markets not only in the context or within the history of how sports have developed. We evaluate it in broader terms, thinking about other industries, other professions, and making comparisons between all of these different types of things. And the forces and the ideas that apply in other professions are not just immediately invalid once we enter the world of sports. We think of these things as working in other things. The broader question is, why wouldn't they work in the world of sports? Anyways, I know that was a very long wound answer to sort of like get at this thing about the Wild West, and just sort of want to say, like, maybe we need to change some of our perspective on that, or at least there's another way in which we can think about these exact same things. Yes?
I just had a quick question back on the Blackhawks Rogers
Yes.
thing. I mean, I find it kind of amazing that if the NHL had asked Rogers to, this is going to be denominated in USD, I'm sure their CFO would have said, there's no way in hell we're assuming the exchange rate risk. So the NHL explicitly took it on. I'm shocked that either they didn't go to the investment banks, or almost more shocking is that Bank of Montreal or Goldman Sachs didn't go to them and say, hey, you're going to need some protection. Your inflows every year were laid out perfectly, so you knew exactly what you needed to hedge. Was there, do you know, did the NHL even contemplate this? Or?
I'm not aware of any conversations along those lines. I mean, certainly I have no doubt that if it was the case that Rogers was being asked to denominate in US dollars, they would have also demanded a reduction in the value of that contract. And of course, that comes at a cost for the National Hockey League, but at the same time, it comes at the benefit of producing far greater stability as it pertains to this very important measure that affects the competitive balance and competitive landscape of the league. But I'm not at all familiar with whether that was something that happened behind the scenes, or to what extent the NHL is able to consider that. It seems like from all outward appearance that wasn't a major consideration given how everything played out. Excellent. Any other thoughts, questions? Yes.
Do you think if the NHL didn't have a cap, do you think the oil prices stuff would affect them more or less? Like maybe the Blackhawks could have kept some of their players?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like the main mechanism through which this thing was affecting things was because that hard salary cap is hard and tied to revenue with this. Now, that said, certainly various things on the margin get affected by exchange rates on this. It would certainly affect the level of competitiveness of Canadian NHL franchises whose revenues is largely coming through in Canadian dollars and their ability to potentially sign players and other things. But I would have made certainly the prediction that the consequences would have been less consequential if it wasn't a world where you had salary cap.
Are Canadian teams even at a disadvantage still today relative to tax policy? I mean, your income tax rate in Toronto is going to be higher than it is in Chicago.
Well, let me leave this also even as an important question, and just as a food for thought. I think I may have asked this also as well in the sports economics class. To the extent that the league always states that competitive balance is a primary reason for having the salary cap on this, why don't they ever care about huge differentials in taxes across different teams? There was no discussion whatsoever around potentially equalizing the after-tax or making the salary cap based on after-tax earnings of the athletes, which would be the logical step were it the case that you strictly wanted to even things out in terms of the incentives to sign with any given team for players. But for reasons that I'll let you speculate on, that has never been part of the conversation. The other thing, too, as I will say, and this is also, certainly part of the class, all of the major competitive balance measures that you ever hear being introduced by leagues always involve some kind of restriction on player earning and player salaries of some sort. Those are not the only ways in which you can affect competitive balance. You could do things where players sign contracts in free market and you have other ex-post labor market reallocations of players, or stricter roster limits in different ways. Another way in which you could also have competitive balance is not by having a salary cap, but by having a robust salary floor. If the problem that you're worried about is that some teams outspend other teams, make the poor teams spend more. That will make the league more competitively balanced. So we got to think about the question of why, when we have conversations about competitive balance in sports leagues, is the conversation always around doing things that cost the athletes? Because the question is, why is it on the athletes in order to take the responsibility and bear virtually all the costs for that? Why is it all on them that we ask that? Because it definitely does not have to be that way if we're looking from the perspective of the overarching objective is enhanced competitive balance. There's lots of ways we could achieve that. Yes?
I'll shut up after this, but just to your point on Canadian teams in hockey, they haven't won the Stanley Cup since '93.
Yes, that's correct.
Which is kind of mind-blowing.
It started out as a bit of sort of like a curiosity, and now it's gone into a full-fledged thing where it's like, if you just look at the random odds of that happening, it's pretty remote now to this point to go for a 3-decade-long Stanley Cup drought in a league that has as many teams as it does. Yes?
You've already depressed me about the Chicago Blackhawks. If you had started talking about Jerry Reinsdorf and the Bulls and the White Sox, I think I definitely have to get a cocktail.
What about the White Sox?
We are really blessed in Chicago to have great owners.
Yeah, I certainly feel for White Sox fans there. It's last season certainly couldn't have been pleasant for anybody.
You can do a whole PhD on that.
Yes, absolutely. Excellent. Any other questions?
It's been a lot longer since the Pirates won.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming and everything. I've really enjoyed this.